I should probably change my name on the screen as well, since I am not Amber.
To say something.
And I am Laura. Well, we use the same Zoom for business. So,
Right.
hello, happy Monday, and welcome to this exclusive Patreon members wine class. We are talking about the beautiful, often underappreciated, if you can believe that, wine region that is Chablis. And I have to say, it is my absolute favorite white wine producing region in the world. So you're in for a real treat because there's no shortage of passion for this great, iconic white wine region. And I think it goes without saying that these days it's really difficult to find affordable Burgundy. And Burgundy being a wine producing region of which Chablis is the northernmost section, Burgundy has become just like a unicorn. It is so difficult to procure. And when you do get it, it's often slightly disappointing because the Grand Crus, the best of the vineyards, have extremely high prices, and they're not ready to drink early. And often we are impatient as wine consumers and we can't wait. So we buy the best of the best Burgundies and we drink them too young. I'm guilty of that as well. And when we're competing with a growing population, thankfully, of wine enthusiasts, the prices are just not even relative to what a producer intends. It's really what the market will bear. So when I think about the great wine regions of the world, the age-worthy ones, the one that we want to collect, and I think about the idea of investing money in wine, and Burgundy is certainly worth it. But as far as drinking wines too young, it's sometimes a shame. It can be in a slightly quiet phase. So with that, I should say that Chablis, for some reason, has not gotten so out of control. And for that, I'm super eternally grateful for these great vignerons, because while they are slowly creeping up compared to the Côte d'Or, the Golden Slope just south, I think they've only gone up, 10% comparatively to regions that have like tripled and quadrupled in even my short time in the wine business. So what we are going to do today is we're talking about where we are located. And if you're not already familiar, Chablis, it's a place. I know for a short period of time, some people were making inexpensive wine and calling it Chablis or Hardy Burgundies. But thankfully, most of fine wine regions, even the United States, stopped doing that. So it's not a box wine, as we thought when I first started drinking wine, but it is a village, and it's located on the banks of the Seine River, and it's in the Yonne department. So this is the northernmost major region in Burgundy. And there are officially three appellations, Appellation or Appellation Origine Protégée, as I'm sure you're all familiar. And those three appellations are Petit Chablis, Chablis AOP, and Chablis Grand Cru AOP, which is slightly confusing because you'll learn from me later that there are 7 Chablis villages that are named as Grand Cru, vineyards rather, that are named as Grand Cru, but they all fall under one appellation called Chablis Grand Cru AOP. And actually the Premier Cru are a sub of that as well. The good news, as we're going to learn a lot of detail as these sort of master classes demand detail, is that it's only Chardonnay grape allowed in these 3 appellations. So if you're labeling Petit Chablis or Chablis AOP or Chablis Grand Cru, the only grape allowed is the noble and terroir driven or terroir expressive Chardonnay grape. There are 17 communes entitled to use Chablis AOP, including the village of Chablis itself. And I think you probably know from learning about other Burgundian regions that the viticulture origins lie in the monastic era. It's only in recent decades, though, that Chablis really earned its designation as Burgundy, you know, other Burgundy wine regions as high, the best of the best. I do think that it's one of the greatest areas in the world for demonstrating truly what soil can do and what climate can do in a wine region. When you have such a neutral grape like the Chardonnay grape, and you're able to see what does it taste like if you use bâtonnage, which is the stirring of the lees, or what does it taste like if you're in a specific exposure like they have in the Grand Cru south and southwest facing, and you have these soils like Kimmeridgian, this limestone and marl based soil and clay, and Portlandian soils, you can really see the difference between one vineyard and the next, and of course between one producer's style and the next, which I find you can't really do that with other grapes. So that's exciting. So the monastic era, over a century ago, before phylloxera, Burgundy began at the village of Sens, and it continued through Auxerre, down to Montbard, and through Dijon. So there was a contiguous vineyard before phylloxera. So Sens is in the Yonne department, and it's about 120 kilometers from Paris. So you can imagine that Chablis is equidistant between Champagne to its north and Sancerre to its, I always have to imagine where I am, Sancerre to its west, and the Côte d'Or to its south. So Paris, Lyon, this autoroute, it cuts through the Chablis vineyard village area, this Yonne department, and it bypasses like wheat fields and cornfields and pasture. So if I think about going to Chablis, it looks like a beautiful but rural part of the French countryside, you know. So you know, it's really a sleepy town, the Chablis village itself, the town of Chablis. But I think you would find, if you wanted to visit, which I always want to visit, and I did, that the town you might want to stay in is Auxerre. This is kind of like a busy, I guess you can call it, city, perhaps the fourth largest city in this, you know, Burgundy kind of area. And it's an inland port, and it has this really adorable, lovable old town. Some churches, as we know, most Burgundy villages do. But there's this Abbey of Saint-Germain, which I visited, and it's going back to the Dark Ages, and it's the earliest Christian church frescoes. So that's fun. You know, there are these timber framed houses, this really fun museum called Le Blanc du Verneau. And anyway, I would highly recommend staying there. There's some beautiful small boutique hotels. So if you're in the interest of visiting Chablis, stay in the town of Auxerre. And with that, let's talk about the stats. Burgundy's northernmost region, and its semi-continental climate. To remind you, semi-continental climate means that it has 4 seasons, and the seasons are extreme. You can have the biggest viticultural disasters of frost during bud break, and hail, you know, during flowering, and a lot of opportunity for frost in the fall. And so when we talk about vintages, we'll talk about these viticultural hazards and what the Chablisians are doing to mitigate these. At times, things called aspersion, which is like spraying the vine with water to seal the vine so that it doesn't drop below freezing. Or we have these little smudge pots, chaufferets, which you can put in the vineyards that are like supposed to circulate warm air. And sometimes they have these little electrical cables they can run near the vine to keep the vine warmer so that they don't have the frost. There are these people that fire cannons in the Chablis vineyards to break up those little molecules that become the hail, and in an effort to prevent losing yield. And so you can imagine we're still really dealing with this as recent vintages. We're still dealing with the threat of these viticultural hazards. So just want to mention 7 geographic designations for Grand Cru AOP. So we're going to give you a fun acronym for remembering those Grand Crus from west to east. But we have Petit Chablis. It doesn't mean teeny Chablis, but rather they have lower alcohol levels than Chablis AOP and higher yields. So you can imagine there's a hierarchy of Grand Cru being the best, Premier Cru the first best, Chablis AOP and Petit Chablis as far as the traditional hierarchy goes, meaning you would pay less money for Petit Chablis than Grand Cru Chablis. But you would also expect maybe less concentration in Petit Chablis or Chablis AOP. You would maybe not want to age your Petit Chablis as long as your Grand Cru or Premier Cru. However, as we know, rules are always meant to be broken, which is to say the best producers that I'm going to tell you my obsessions about, I will buy their Petit Chablis, and their Petit Chablis might be better than some of the other producers' Grand Cru Chablis. So always producer first. If you're following a producer and you love their style and you find yourself an opportunity to drink their village, just keep in mind you might want to drink it a couple years earlier. So we'll talk about how age-worthy is Chablis, and the answer is very age-worthy. And there is one unofficial 8th Grand Cru, which is called Le Mouton, which sits between or straddles 2 of the other Grand Cru, and it's a monopole. To remind you, it means monopoly, of which one producer owns. We're going to talk about this beautiful soil. It's 150 million years old, Kimmeridgian marl, and it has these Ixogyra virgula fossils. Basically, it's a way of saying comma-shaped oyster shells. These funny names make us sound really intelligent in the wine business, but the truth is these are soils that were under sea, and that these fossilized sea creatures become part of the soils, and they import or they help with the minerality. They show this minerality so well. And a little bit younger soil called Portlandian soil. There are 2 types. It's only 120 million years, so very young, joking, which is generally considered slightly inferior to the Kimmeridgian soil, which is to say they make different wines. The Grand Cru slopes are mostly Kimmeridgian marl, and some of the other sort of Portlandian soils you'll find in like the Chablis Village or some of the Premier Cru. But they are still very old, and they impart fruitier flavors, the Portlandian soils, compared to Kimmeridgian marl. With that said, I don't know that I could tell the difference if I was blind tasting. Oh, this is Kimmeridgian for sure. Kimmeridgian, named after a little village in Dorset in England, which is the same soil that you find in the hills of Dorset, this Kimmeridgian marl. And you also find it in Sancerre. And so as I was preparing and reading this really great wine book by Oz Clarke, I was reminded about the fact that just like we said, it was equidistant Chablis from Champagne to Sancerre, and at times to the Côte d'Or, I find that the wines can show very much like those wine regions too. So I've had Champagne that drinks like sparkling Chablis, which I love, right? That minerality and the best champagnes from the Aube that reminds me of if Chablis was sparkling. And I've had some Sancerre, because if it's grown on Kimmergidian Marl, it's hard to tell the difference sometimes from a ripe Sauvignon Blanc from Sancerre and a green, slightly leesy Chablis. So how do I describe the best Chablis? I say leesy, cheesy, lemon squeezy, which is kind of a joke, but it does roll off the tongue. There is a cheese rind that I find so intriguing in grape Chablis. It's almost like that grape pecorino, Parmesan. There's a leesy quality. If you remember lees from Champagne, it's the autolysis or the breakdown of yeast. And there's a special barrel that they use in Chablis called the Foyette, which is half the size of a Burgundy barrel. And they can stir it in such a way to incorporate this lees into the wine in a way that really makes the wine have what I describe as lees sometimes is like chive. Do you know, like when you have like a young green vegetable, how it has a little bit of that slightly sweet green? So you can get that in Chablis. And sometimes I can confuse that for Sauvignon Blanc from Sancerre, because Sauvignon Blanc from Sancerre might have pyrazine. Anyway, with that said, they're totally different wines. But the lemon sort of racy, linear, acidic line that runs through Chablis is like no other, right? I mean, high acid white wines that have texture is really hard to find in the world. Okay, so vineyards decimated by odium, phylloxera, war, frosts between 1888 and 1959. And here's some fun facts. Phylloxera hit the area in 1893, which was slightly later than that of the Côte d'Or. There was the Paris railway that really hurt Chablis, because once it connected Paris to the south, like to Bordeaux, the demand for Chablis in Paris decreased. World War I, economic stagnation. In 1945, not a single bottle of Chablis was produced. That was because of frost. So there were less than 500 hectares at that time. And as late as 1956, the locals were skiing in February down Lake Clos, which you'll come to learn is the best Grand Cru that exists. So that's pretty crazy. I mean, it was a ski resort. If you are drinking, I think you're drinking Christian Moreau, and he's a beautiful man, and he's an avid skier. You follow him on Instagram, you're always seeing him ski. Not anymore in his vineyards for obvious reasons. It's not that cold anymore. But in 1956, I can imagine he was a younger gentleman skiing his way through Lake Clos. So currently there are 6,834 acres in our beautiful Chablis, which give or take a couple acres is about like 16,900 acres. So it's expanded a little bit, but they haven't really expanded the Grand Cru and Premier Cru. So the vineyards were delimited in 1919 and the appellation in 1939. You know, in 2003, there was an additional 2,500 extra hectares added. But with that said, they were almost exclusively added to the AOP of Chablis and Petit Chablis. So why Burgundy is the way it is, we talked about this, but the Roman Empire, the records date back to 200 AD, and the vineyards were developed by the monks. We know that the monks looked up these slopes and saw different undulations in the slopes and said, the snow is melting there first, therefore it must be the best exposure, must get the most sun. That should be considered a higher vineyard, better quality than the low-lying hills or the flatlands or even parts of the mid-slope. So if you think about Grand Cru, you want to think about it as like the tenderloin, the best exposure. And it depends on the region. In our case, we want south-facing vineyards in Chablis. And all of the Grand Crus do face south and southwest because that's where we're going to get the most sun. In other parts of Grand Cru systems throughout France, they have different exposures, of course. And so the ownership was primarily the church and the royalty. And then we had the French Revolution. We know the assets were confiscated. These small vineyard parcels were purchased by merchants and the merchant class. And now we have vineyards that are owned by 15 to 90 different owners. When we get into the Grand Cru and Premier Cru, I'm going to tell you that some people own, like my favorite producer, Ravenel, and even the best of their vineyard holdings, they only own 0.5 hectare. So very small pieces. We do have some negociants. We have a cooperative that owns 1/3 of the Chablis region called Chablisian. And so we can imagine there's a lot to learn. We talked a little bit about this already. German bombardment during World War II, not a single bottle of Chablis produced. The interesting thing is that there's a lot of machine harvested grapes in Chablis, which you might not think of that, right? Because when we think about machine harvests, we're like, wait a minute, the best regions are normally hand harvested, and that's true. But there are still a significant amount of the wines made in Chablis that are using machine harvesting by machine. And there's a move right now in some of the monopoles of the Côte d'Or, the Grand Crus, like Romani Conti, rather, the Grand Cru, and a few others like Clos de Tart, where these producers that own monopoles are saying they're going to mandate that Grand Crus are not harvested by machine and only can harvest by hand. It hasn't been officially recognized as a rule, but it's more like a self-regulation right now. And all of these monopole holders of these vineyards are doing it. But Chablis, they're still harvesting by machine, even for Grand Cru. Now, of course, when we talk about producers, you'll learn that a number of them are just deciding to do a hand harvest. And you could imagine the attention to detail is greater. And so 95% of the vineyards are harvested by machine. That's a lot. Premier Crus were added in 1967. And as I mentioned, the stats are going up. Chablis, in 1970, Chablis produced less than 20,000 hectoliters of wine. And in 1982, it's about 118,000 hectoliters. And in 2012, very modest in terms of the vintage, the three AOPs recorded over 300,000 hectoliters of vines from more than 5,000 hectares of vines. So here it is, though, stats. Thankfully, 2% are still Chablis Grand Cru, and only 14% of those numbers I just mentioned are Premier Cru. So the majority is in those quote unquote lesser appellations, Chablis, Petit Chablis. And as we know, 20% of the production of all of Burgundy is in Chablis. So that's not even a lot for such a world recognized wine producing region. They make 20% of the production of Burgundy. Qualifies to be declassified. So you can label Chablis as Bourgogne AOP, and you can blend it and make sparkling wine, but you would have to call it Cremant de Bourgogne. You could not call it Cremant de Chablis or anything like that. Fun fact.
Laura, question.
Yes.
Laura, question. So, like this bottle says First Cru.
Premier Cru.
Premier Cru?
That is right.
Okay.
Yes. The French abbreviate Premier Cru as 1ER Cru. So yeah, that's a great question. We'll see that elsewhere besides just Chablis. We'll see like Premier Cru written like 1ER. It's essentially an abbreviation in other parts of Burgundy, but that's a great question. And as you know, you can also name the Premier Cru after you write. So I think for yours, are you drinking Vaillon? What's the name?
Hold it up. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Yeah, the light is getting, but I think I saw that earlier. So yeah, so
Yeah.
we'll talk a lot about that. I'll tell you all about it, what it's supposed to taste like, and you'll tell me if that is showing like a classic Vaillon when we get to it. Okay, so here's our issues. We have semi-continental climate, frost and hail. This is a photo here of a chaufferette. Basically, it's a little pot, and they keep the area, the microclimate around, literally around a vine, warmer. I remember visiting when I did a cruise in April of Burgundy, and like, first of all, the night sky when you're driving through the vineyards is just illuminated. It looks like something out of a crazy world war or something, because you just see like all these little lights in the skies, like these beautiful vineyards, but it's like all lit up. But then you smell this like vine burn, not the vine, not of the one that is producing fruit, but like old wood, just burning in little pots. And just like even sometimes the smell of like, I don't think they use propane, but just in the area, right? And so chaufferettes, aspersion, they protect the vine. There is this group of producers that are it's called ANELFA. It's an Association Nationale des Études et de Lutte contre les Flux Atmosphériques. Anyway, ANELFA is the abbreviation, and they basically shoot these cannons of silver iodide into the clouds, which turns the hail into rain. It increases the ice crystals and reduces the size of the hail, and they fall slower. And in theory, that will prevent those hail when the berries are on the vines from like basically splitting the grapes in half. So those are interesting. That's like all these new things that are happening. And let's see, climate change, it's more erratic. I guess we can say climate change is good for Chablis because it's not as cold as it once was, but then you're getting hot and cold, and it's just a little nutty. Back to our soils. Portlandian soil is younger than our Kimmeridgian soil. It's only about 130 years, and it's sandier, and it's thinner than our Kimmeridgian soil. Kimmeridgian is 150 years old, and Kimmeridgian soils are chalky and clay. And I told you already, they're ancient sea creatures. They were dried and settled at the bottom of the seas, and it's a limestone and clay base. Whereas Portlandian is younger, it's harder, it's more brittle, and it doesn't have the fossils. And it is said to produce fruitier wines, wines that are maybe approachable and younger. So you can find most of the Grand Cru and the very best of the Premier Cru on the Kimmeridgian, and the Petit Chablis is on Portlandian soil. So with that said, we're talking about these duo of soils. I already mentioned a Jurassic era, these tiny oyster shells. They create these ridges in the plateaus around the Seine River Valley. And these are for the best sites, Kimmeridgian soil. We're really talking about like this, like almost warmer soils that have this clay in them and help produce wines that have more depth and concentration. Producers, there's a ton of them. I'm going to talk a lot about these amazing ones that I find to be the best. The typical producer might make 6 to 10 different wines: Chablis, Petit Chablis, 1 Premier Cru, 1 Grand Cru, 4 Premier Crus, 5 Grand Crus. So it's a varying amounts depending on the producer. There are 23 negociants. Like you still see people like Drouin, Jadot, they're in the area, and still, as you can see comparatively, that most producers are individual growers. The cooperative 25% of the production, although the one co-op, Chablisian, they make 1/3 of the total production of the area. There are some producers that like to use new oak or neutral oak, and still a few that don't want any oak at all and are only aging their wines in stainless steel. As you can imagine, the Grand Crus can take a little more either neutral oak or slightly more new oak. And generally, the village level and Petit Chablis are not going to invest in the cost of new oak. So you can mix and match. And I follow producers, and I like to talk about where on their school of grape growing where do they fall? Are they completely against new oak? Are they completely against any oak? And then, of course, bâtonnage, the stirring of the leaves, is not as common as it once was. You're going to get a copy of this presentation. So we have producers that start in the savory camp all the way to the fruity categories, and those are some of our major ones. They're not all, of course, but if you're a fan of one producer style, perhaps if you can't find them, you might choose something in that same savory quality. So when I think about my favorite white wine in the world, of which I drink anytime there's a major celebration, it is Francois Ravenel. Favorite white wine in the, forget white wine, favorite wine in the world, Francois Ravenel. I drank it the day after my son was born, drank it on my wedding, my first date with my husband, I drank it. People love Ravenel. It's, if you ask 9 out of 10 sommeliers, what's your favorite white wine region, favorite white wine in the world? They'll say, oh, Ravenel. And if you haven't had Ravenel, sorry to your wallet, go out and do it. It's a bucket list wine. It is worth every penny. It is extremely age-worthy. It is extremely highly allocated. I think we get 2 bottles a year. Places maybe like 11 Madison Park get more, but I buy from retail whatever I can find. So I walked into a wine shop in Napa Valley and I saw these magnums of Ravenel sitting on the shelf. And I was like, are those for sale? They're like, you must know wine. Anyway, there are others that I love as well, which we're going to discuss. Vincent Dovisat, Laurent Tribu. You're seeing a trend, right? My favorite 3 producers of Chablis are all in the savory quality. So Ravenel to me tastes like, when you smell Ravenel, you cannot possibly not know it is Chablis, and you cannot possibly know that it's not Ravenel. Like, it's like one of those things that you can blind taste producer, which is hard to say. Like, I can do that with Ravenel and Reyes, another red wine from Châteauneuf-du-Pape. But, it's white chocolate and mint. It's like, it is always that. And the first time I had it, I didn't know what it was. So somebody was like, you want to drink some Ravenel? I was living in Las Vegas. Larry Stone was visiting, and they were opening a wine from the casino because they had a great night and we could open anything we wanted. And since Larry Stone was coming, we wanted to impress him. And I was pretending like I knew what it was, but like, I didn't know if it was red or white. They were like, you want to drink Ravenel? I was like, yeah. Because you don't say like, do you want to drink Ravenel Chablis Les Clos? You just say you want to drink Ravenel. And it's assumed that you know what it is. And it was 1999 Les Clos, the best bottle of wine in my life. Okay, so let's talk about them. We're going to talk about the producers first. Only a few, and we're going to highlight them. Domaine Francois Ravenel. So 7.5 hectares total. It's a very small amount of ownership. There were brothers, and it was very small. Bernard and Jean-Marie Ravenel. Sometimes you'll still see, they currently run the domain. In older vintages, you'll see their father's name on the label, Francois Ravenel. And they harvest entirely by hand. Very, very low yields, like way past the minimum, way past the minimum required. So just to remind us, Grand Crus have a lower minimum yield than the villages, and a higher level of minimum alcohol. Maximum yield. The higher the quality, the lower the yields. Sorry if I inverted that. It's just my mind. I'm thinking low yield, so I'm whatever. Anyway, Ravenel uses natural yeast, They age their wines for plus or minus 18 months in old oak. Very important, old oak, no new oak, but no stainless steel. So older oak, and the barrels are those Chablis barrels called Foyette, which are half the size of the traditional Burgundy barrel. And that's what gives it this texture that's decadent and concentrated. The low yields, the old vines, the neutral oak, they're considered to be one of the most traditional of all producers. They own Grand Crus in Les Clos, but only half a hectare. In Valmore, in only like 3/4 of a hectare, and in Blanchot, which is 0.6 of a hectare. So very small holdings. They have Premier Cru, which we're going to learn about, Monte de Tonnerre, Moment Vaillon, which I think you're drinking, Buteau, Chapelet, and Forest. Les Forêts, by the way, just want to point out, there are multiple ways to spell a vineyard. So sometimes you're going to see it spelled like forest, and sometimes foray with accent. So it's not wrong the way we're having it spelled here. And I'm trying to honor the spelling of the way the producer labels it. With that said, if you're wanting to know what I consider to be equal in terms of quality, maybe the second favorite Chablis producer, it's the domaine of Vincent d'Auvissat. And that was established by Robert d'Auvissat, the father of Renee and Vincent. And they are, or sorry, Robert was Renee's father and Renee is Vincent's father. So 3 generations. They have some of the oldest and the best vineyard holdings. By comparison, they have about 5 hectares more than Ravenel, so slightly larger, but still very small. And they have some of their oldest vines are, you know, for Chablis, 40-year-old Via Vigne. They eschew batonnage, so no batonnage at all. Grand Cru, they have a pretty big piece of Les Clos, but big by the standards, 1.7 hectares. And Le Prusse, they have about 1 hectare. I love that their holding of what they label as Petit Chablis is a vineyard that's right above Les Clos. So that's one of those, like, secret sommelier thing from me to you. When you see Petit Chablis from Vincent d'Auvissat, you buy it because it is a vineyard that is right above Les Clos. Even though they don't label it like that, that's a steal. Any questions so far? Okay, we're going to keep going. Louis Michel. So we're going to talk about Louis Michel. It was important to me to mention them because they exclusively use stainless steel ever since 1969. They have about double the size of Vincent d'Auvissat, so they're about 23 hectares, still small, as you can imagine, comparatively. They really believe in a slow fermentation. So, you know, kind of 6 to 18 months of these lees quality. So when you're thinking about what I said, cheesy, lemon squeezy, Louis Michel is a great example. I think a lot of times when you're blind tasting, they are a better example of Chablis because they show more of that lees quality. I remember at my MS exam, a lot of times I didn't know this until I passed, but Louis Michel was a great wine to blind taste. Master sommelier candidates. Fresh, pure, mineral, that's their style. And they have a Grand Cru of Les Clos, Le Grenouille, Val d'Isère as well. It's 5th generation. They harvest by hand, and they don't have a stick of oak in their winery except for like 1 ornamental barrel and very low temperatures. So slow and low is how I remember Louis Michel. William Fèvre. This is about double the size of Louis Michel, so 48 hectares. They sold the domain to Henriot, champagne producer, in 1998. And they have a significant amount of the Grand Crus. They have Bouguereau, Les Clos, Grenouille, Les Prusse, Valmore, Val d'Isère. I'm rattling them off later. You're going to see them lined up in a amphitheater, so you'll know where they are. But they hand harvest and they don't use bâtonnage. And sometimes they're critiqued as having a little too much wood, a little too much oak, has been said, although less new oak lately. So that's a good thing. And they're ripe and they're very powerful. So that's cool. Domaine La Roche, one of the largest, Chablis in stainless steel for the AOP. And then they use some oak for Premier Cru and more oak for the Grand Cru. Again, fruity, forward. Sometimes my favorite Chablis producers don't use as much oak. So it's not that I think they're bad Chablis producer. They're very important because they're one of the largest. They have about double the size of William Febvre. So you can imagine it went from smallest Ravenel, then Vincent d'Auvissat, then Louis Michel, then Febvre, then La Roche. So they have about 100 hectares, give or take. And, you know, what am I drinking?
So question,
Here you go.
Question. Okay, go ahead. What are you drinking?
Oh, no, I'm drinking this. I'm drinking Domaine Moreau Nadet. So I wanted to put them in here, even though they're relatively new. They only have 22 hectares, so they're small-ish. And Stéphane Moreau, he took over the winery in 1999. A very low yields. That's one of the reasons I love these wines. Currently made by Stéphane, who passed away in 2016, rather, very suddenly. It's made by his wife, Virginie, and I am drinking the village level, but honestly, right now, it is so concentrated. I'm drinking the 19, which is definitely one of the reasons. It's a warmer and more concentrated vintage, but one of the only domains in Chablis. There's a couple other experimenting, but converted to biodynamics, which is rare. And they use gentle new oak for some of their Grand Cru or for their Valmore, but it's really a lightly oaked wine. Okay, your question.
Okay, so the negociants, basically, so in Burgundy, you inherit it from your family, right?
Yes.
And so I saw on the previous one, they sold their vineyard to somebody else. So it doesn't have to go through the family, it can be sold.
Yeah, I think that historically the Napoleonic Code dictated that you must divide your land evenly amongst your heirs. So I think that was really when we say you inherit your land, but you are still, especially now, able to sell your land. It's just that if you had a brother and a sister, you couldn't say, I'm gifting all of my land to the brother or to the son and not the daughter. You had to divide up the property, the vineyards. Does that make sense?
But you can sell it. That's why negotiants
Yes,
now.
you can sell it. You can sell it.
Yeah, they just don't buy the grapes. They can actually buy your percentage of that plot, that
Correct.
vineyard.
Correct.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense. Okay.
Great. I love these questions. They're so thoughtful because you're taking a lesson from the past and you're remembering it, recalling it, and then trying to clarify as it relates to a new lesson, which is really the best way to solidify things, building on things. And sometimes in wine, I think what we do is we gift information in small morsels. Like we don't give everybody everything at once because then your brain shuts down. So I'm glad that question got brought up. Chablisian Co-op started in 1923. They represent 300 growers and some, lots of new oak. That's like the biggest critique. They have 600 casks in the co-op, and every year they make 100 new. They buy 100 new barrels. So it's okay. I think So Oz Clarke called them.
So that brings the oak and the butteriness of a wine, like a California
not necessarily
wine.
butter. Butter, I think, is more of malolactic fermentation. When you have the conversion of malic acid into lactic acid, then you get something called diacetyl, which is something that gives you movie butter popcorn. New oak just gives you that kind of vanilla, heavy sauce, right? It's a sweeter kind of like it can top off a wine and make it broader than it needs to be. So sometimes when you have such a delicate, nervy, acidic, racy, neutral grape like Chardonnay and you clobber it with new oak, it tastes like, you put a piece of fluke crudo with brown poivre sauce. Not necessarily what we want. Now, with that said, if you have a riper, more celebrated vineyard and it's concentrated and the vintage is such that it's low yields, okay, maybe it can wear a little more of that poivre sauce. But the more nervy the wine, the less you want to use new oaks. So Oz Clarke called it oak abused. I love that. I was like, oak abused. I'm going to use that more often. Not necessarily for Chablis, but definitely for some California Chardonnays. They're oak abused. Here's some producers to watch that I didn't mention because I can't name them all. I'm obsessed with Demour. I really like Demour Chablis. I love Laurent Tribut. So Demour is only like half the size of Ravenel, this label here. There are 6.5 hectares. They only started in 1988. They're being called the rising stars of Chablis. They're doing everything by hand. Everything is old barrels, no sulfur. They're also experimenting with biodynamics. So they're another producer. But they don't have any Grand Cru and no Premier Cru. We often carry the Demour Chablis on our list and we love them. The other that I need to tell you about is Tribut. And actually I need to buy more Tribut. I like was preparing this and I was like, oh yeah, I should be buying more of those. So Laurent Tribut, 5.2 hectares. It's Vincent Dovisat's sister, which is Marie Clotilde, that owns the domain. And they do hand harvested, natural yeasts, old barrels. And they're really mineral, they're really clean, they're really classy. And speaking of classy, the one that you're drinking, oh wait, no, you're not drinking. Oh yeah, you are drinking Christian Moreau, sorry. Christian Moreau wines, beautiful. I mean, I am in love with these wines and I absolutely love Christian. He's a really dear friend of my friend, Yannick Benjamin. And I just saw that Yannick was visiting him in Chablis and his face is like Santa Claus, but he's bald. He's like jolly and he's like warm and he gives the greatest hugs. And he has some of the best vineyards in all of Chablis, of course, La Clos, and you're drinking their Premier Cru, but his village level Chablis is not to be missed. And I'm loving that you have the opportunity to compare these. Did you want to talk about what you're finding? Do you see concentration in the Premier Cru and a little bit more like linear, lighter style in the village?
Yes, they're very different.
Yes.
Definitely the Premier Cru is it's an 18.
18.
So it's a smooth, it's crisp, it has a great mouthfeel. And then the Village is a 2020. And then it's kind of a little bit more fruity. It has more expression of the grape. It's a little rougher, which is not bad. We actually like both.
Yeah.
It just depends on where you're at. But the difference from the same vineyard, now, of course, there's 4 years difference, but it's really an interesting contrast.
Yeah, I love that. You said a lot of great things. I mean, especially you can like both of them. And you can imagine you can definitely have a progression of a meal where you start with the village, that they're like more nervy and fruitier and not without concentration, but they're simpler. They have a shorter finish. And move on to the texture of your Premier Cru. And also, you're going to find that. I mean, you're not generally in a retail store going to see Premier Cru and Grand Cru from the same vintage as the village, because the idea is that the village is going to be the current release, and the current release of the Grand Crus are generally a couple years, 4 years behind that of the village, right? This is 2022 that we're in right now. So 2020 is the current vintage for a village Chablis that we're seeing in the market. So that was great. I love those comments. Okay, let's talk about the Grand Crus of Chablis. I say beautiful, pretty vines grow very little berries. That's an acronym for remembering from if you're going west to, I guess, east and south, the Chablis Grand Crus. Beautiful, pretty vines grow very little berries. So we'll talk about these in order: Bouguereau, Prusse, Val d'Isere, Grenouille, Valmore, Les Clos, and Blanchot. The eighth climat, they're called climat, they're called ludis, they're basically vineyards. This climat is overlapping Prusse a little bit and Val d'Isere. It's called La Moutonne. You might see this on the label sometimes. This is permitted as technically the eighth Grand Cru. Left to right from the town of Chablis, that's my acronym. Beautiful, pretty, very beautiful, pretty vines grow very little berries. And that's true. They grow less grapes. The more concentrated, the lower the yields, the less grapes, the lower the yield. So generally considered the best is Les Clos, which also happens to be the largest. There's different exposure in Les Clos, but you can see it's kind of like as you follow the Sereine River, it's called the right bank of the river. And then there's the Premier Cru. Some of them are on the left bank of the river, but they follow the Sereine River. So Grenouille is the smallest of the Grand Cru that's forming this triangle shape. But there's a number of great Grand Cru. So we're going to talk about them. But Valmore and Val d'Isere, these two V's, they're generally considered really great when they age, as well as Les Clos when it ages. Valmore and Val d'Isere. And I guess you can say that they consider Bouguereau and Blanchot the less fine of the Grand Cru. And that's perhaps because they're on the sort of external or outer parts of the hill. Like, they're this amphitheater that is south and southwest facing. It's warmer. And let's see.
So they grow less, or they prune less? Or they prune more?
The vines are generally self-regulating to produce less on these hillsides. The soil helps the vines produce less. The vines are older, so they produce less. You're pruning, yes, more. You're dropping fruit or pruning more to concentrate the vines. So the answer is yes. You would reduce the yield if you needed to, because the yields by law are lower than that of the Premier Cru in the villages. Make sense? Okay, Bouguereau, we're going to talk northwestern edge, low slope. Like I mentioned, it's not as highly regarded. Its style is full-bodied, it's supple, it has ripe fruit. I love those things about it. Sometimes they say that the fruitiness of the wines overshadow the minerality. So what about this? If I want to drink Grand Cru Chablis young, I want to drink Bouguereau. So sometimes I can't wait for my Ravenot to age, and I have Grand Cru, so I'm going to drink my Bouguereau, even though I shouldn't really drink it and I should put it away. It's they call it four squared. It's kind of like broader. Let's see, who said this? That they're kind of like chocolatey. William Fev. I read a tasting note from William Fev, and they said that they were tendre and douce trait, so like tender and sweet, like chocolate. That was a nice way to describe Bouguereau. I've definitely found that. So then we go to Les Prusse, and it's the northwestern edge of the flank. So you can see it's like a little bit either sitting higher up on this in this flank of Grand Crus, and it's north of that. And you have these undulating vineyards that mainly face due south. So they call it like the fourth place. It's like, if you think about the best being Les Clos, then Les Prusse is like fourth best, if you will. It's very sunny in this higher slope, and the soils are stonier. So we often say It's ripe and succulent, but it's not as elegant and steely. So why would somebody like that? If you don't like the really racy mineral classic Chablis, this might be the Grand Cru for you. It's only about 10.5 hectares in this Grand Cru. A big producer, the co-op owns a lot of this Grand Cru, and Dovisat has some as well. Next, we go to Val d'Isère, and this is really well protected. This sort of, you can see the top of the hill is like this amphitheater, and with Lake Clos, it would be considered, I guess, the second best. One of the best mid-high slope Val d'Isère stretches in a bend, and it has two main sides. The southeastern side, they say, is more rich and floral and voluptuous. And this is where you find the monopole of La Moutonne. It's mostly in this Grand Cru of Val d'Isère, although it kind of overlaps a little piece of Les Prousses. And I really love the floral in these wines. Like when I'm having Louis Michel, Val d'Isère, which I've had quite a bit, I find always this like white flower, lilac in Val d'Isère, which is quite nice. And they have an ability to really show that mineral, very much like Lake Clos and Valmore do. So with that, we're going to go to a little bit further south in Grenouille. They would consider the lowest on the slope. I guess most of the Grand Cru, because it's only a small amount, a small Grand Cru in general, only 9 hectares, of which 7 is owned by the co-op. So maybe it's the fact that most of the wines we see in the market are co-op, and so it's said to be, I guess, the least regarded of all the Grand Cru, and it forms a triangle, and it's at the bottom of the slope. And so, you know, hard to say, but the co-op makes a Château de Grenouille. I think it means frog, and you know, it's not bad, but you can see a lot of the negociants are located here in this Grand Cru. Next, we'll go to Valmore. It's a very small part that is in the main road, and that is not as highly regarded, but the above Le Grenouille, firm and full-bodied. So there's one part that's not as well regarded on the bottom of the slope, but Valmore in general, along with Val d'Isère, is considered to be really firm, really restrained, and tons of minerality. And I love the Ravenel Valmore. Full-bodied, but racy and mineral. So Lake Clos sometimes is fullest, but not as mineral driven. So we'll go there next. You can see Lake Clos is the biggest. The King has a lot more rocky soils. So these soils help drain the water, and they make really powerful concentrated mineral wines. They say sometimes they're going to be the longest lived, which means that you don't want to drink them early because they only begin to show their real potential after a decade. So that's why I was saying I have a bottle of Lake Clos from Ravenel and a bottle of Bouguereau from Ravenel. I'm drinking my Bouguereau early because Lake Clos needs another decade. So I'm not drinking my Ravenel Lake Clos anytime in the next 10 years. And there's a Clos de Hospice, which is owned by the Moreaus and Christian Moreau, and they dedicate this wine to the Hospice de Beaune. So they make some auction wines for the hospital in Beaune from this bottom piece of land in Lake Clos. And so the top producers all have holdings in this 27.5 hectare Grand Cru. And then last but not least, we'll go to Blanchot, which I love as well. I think Blanchot can, even though people say that maybe it's not as good, and the B's are like the 5th best of the 7 Grand Crus, I actually think that they're quite good. I have found them really accessible when they're young, but powerful, floral, feminine. And so I really like them. And this is sandwiched between Lake Clos and what is considered to be the best Premier Cru of Chablis. So just to recap, you have beautiful, pretty vines growing very little berries. And that's how you remember them in their order from the town of Chablis going east. I mentioned this is a domain, Langue des Péquis, which is owned by Albert Bichot. It's a monopole, which is considered to be the unofficial Grand Cru called La Moutonne. It's not recognized because it wasn't defined, but it's considered to be a unofficial Grand Cru. So if you're interested, you can try this rich, sort of bigger style. If you see La Moutonne, it's owned by this producer. Now to go to the Chablis Premier Cru, because you are drinking Vaillon, so you might as well know where your wines are coming from. This Premier Cru, you can see the Grand Cru right here. Remember when we were zoomed in on it? It's on the right bank of the river. And then we have the Seine River that bisects the Chablis region and some of these towns that can allow Chablis to be produced. These towns, right? Beru, Viviers, those are town names, the bigger names on this menu. But there are 40 named climats, 17 major Premier Crus. They're called Ludi, then that means named place. And they range in size. They can be small, like a half a hectare or 100 hectares. So we have this unofficial. Yep.
Sorry. So where on there is the place that you said go visit if you're going to Chablis?
It's not on the. It's right here, but
Okay.
Chablis is a town.
Back towards Paris.
Yeah, but it's not far. You can like it's maybe what is that? 8 kilometers. No, Paris this way, but it's not by Paris. It's like 120 kilometers from Paris. It's closer to Chablis. Okay. It's like the next village over. Okay. So 8 kilometers Thank you. From Chablis to Auxerre. It's right here. That's the way, but it's like not on the map, but it's very close. You can stay there. So here's where your wine is from, Vaillon, right over here. But the best, supposedly, again, this is all like, according to people, but I would argue that the best Premier Crus are Vaillon here, Montmont right south of it. But officially, there's a couple on the right bank near the Grand Crus. So you see Fort Charme. A lot of people talk about that one. Monte de Tonnerre, which is Thunder Mountain. They make a really good wines. And Montemelu, those are on the right bank. But a lot of the Premier Crus, they're on the left bank of the river. So they're the best Premier Crus are still on the Kimmeridgian soil. And I can tell you, like, just to highlight a few of them, 70% more than in 1978. There's 70% more Premier Cru wines. And Vaillon, like I said, Côte de l'Eche, these two right here on the left bank, they are equal in terms of quality to the 3 best vineyards on the right bank. I would say the biggest difference they say as a generalization is that the left side is less powerful and more floral. So maybe you're finding a little bit of floral in the Vaillon, and that the Monte de Tonnerre is nuttier and maybe a little more steely because they're not far from the Grand Cru. Do you find any floral in your Vaillon? Yeah. These are just like, a little floral, okay? These are just like our left bank, right bank. You kind of just zoom in and you can see our Premier Cru on the right bank and our Premier Cru on the left bank of the river. Those are not official terms, but just I mentioned this already. The left bank, here we have more powerful and complex Montmont, but adjacent valleys. I like some Dovizade La Forest. Those are also really beautiful wines. So you see it spelled here La Forêt, but it's also called La Forest. So sometimes you have both spellings. And now I want to spend a few minutes talking about when to drink Chablis. So Grand Cru.
Okay, so before you start,
Yes.
sorry, before you start, so the Premier Cruise, you said there's new ones, so there must be an active process. What does it take to be a
Oh,
Grand
there
Cru
really
versus a
haven't.
Premier Cru?
There really haven't been many new ones since 78, but at the time,
Right.
yeah, at the time, I think some were forgotten and they reorganized some. So while there are 40 Premier Cruise, there are really 17 major ones. But you know, it's kind of like you apply to the INAO, it gets approved, but there really haven't been that many more, only since, well, since the 70s. There's 70% more. But yeah, I don't know that it's an exact thing. I think producers apply, it's a paperwork and process, and you prove that, well, you have to follow the yields, lower yields, you have to follow
Right.
the higher alcohol levels. But other than that, it's like, you know, politics a little bit to get approved.
Fair enough, thank you.
So I wanted to say that we generally think about drinking our Grand Cru Chablis anywhere from 5 to 12 years. Premier Cru 3 to 8 years, you know, with 3 to 8 years of age. Village maybe 1 to 4, and Petit Chablis 6 months to 2 years. I put some of the top vintages from 2020 on the slide, not that I'm going to read them to you, but I just wanted to point out, when I say classic, that means a very traditional cold and racy acidity, fresher wines. When I say warmer, you can feel it more intense concentration, tropical, exotic. So when you see those terms, like if you're a classic Chablis lover like I am, you probably like the cooler vintages. If you like some of the warmer vintages, you know, those are great if you're introducing people to Chablis for the first time and they're generally liking New World fruitier wines. Now, with that said, they're still Chablis. So because you have the 2020, that's very classic, very linear. It was a very early vintage. They say similar to 2017 and similar to 2014. That's the 2020 vintage. So quite nice if you like the classic. And I think you said you had 18 too? Yeah. So that was very hot.
Sorry.
Yeah, very hot vintage, very early, very bountiful. So they like the 18. And I'm drinking 18 as well. So like, oh wait, no, I'm drinking the 19. That's right. I pulled a bottle of the Chablis Village, and that was a very low vintage. So why I like the 19s right now is they're highly concentrated. So they're approachable, they're minerals, they're low yields. So we have a lot of intensity here that I quite like, but it's still really classic in terms of its acidity. So just things to think about. You know, Christian Moreau, he said on 18 vintage versus 2017 vintage. In the 17, it took 10 vines to fill a basket because the yields were so badly affected by the frost. So yes, it's a good vintage in quality, but bad for a vineyard because it's such a low yield. And in 2018, one vine filled a whole basket. So the yields were reduced so much by the frost in the spring because the bud break was interrupted, and then the flowers become grapes. And then if there's no flowers, there's no grapes. So I thought that was really interesting. If you're thinking about two vintages right back to back, one's bountiful, one's so restricted in yields. So with that, I want to say cheers. I hope you enjoyed my class on Chablis. I had the best time with you, and I really love this region. It's so fun to revisit a favorite, a classic Chablis, and find reasons to be like, why is this so different? One vintage to the next, one producer to the next, one vineyard to the next. And I think we kind of summed it up. So I'll send you the recording so you can rewatch, and I will send you this presentation in PDF form and the outlines, just like we always do, in the next day and a half, 2 days max. And so cheers. I hope to see you in person soon and give you a big hug. Thanks for being,
Nice to see you too, Laura.
Yeah.
thanks for being flexible with my last calendar of this class, and I will see you and hug you in person.
Yes,
deal.
for sure.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye, Lauren. Thank you.